The rain in the Herkin Forest had a special kind of malice. This was late 1944, and the world had run out of color. Everything was just shades of brown and gray. The mud that sucked at your boots, the splintered trees that clawed at the sky, and the faces of the men I had left. We were ghosts haunting a dead forest, and every day, Germany sent its own ghosts to try and kill us. We'd been bled white taking a single pillbox the day before, losing 4 men, including our platoon leader, a captain who'd been with us since Normandy. Command's solution, as always, was a replacement. He arrived looking like he'd stepped out of a recruitment poster. Second Lieutenant Richard Hayes. His uniform was clean, the crease in his trousers was still sharp, and his face was pale and unlined. He couldn't have been more than 20. He carried a brand-new M1 carbine like it was a foreign object, something he was afraid might bite him. I took one look at him, and my stomach turned. He was a lamb, and we were in a slaughterhouse. My name is Sergeant Frank Sullivan. They call me Sully, and it's my job to keep the wolves from the flock. But sometimes, command sends a lamb to lead the sheep, and that's when men die for nothing. From the first moment, he was wrong. He didn't bark orders or try to prove he was in charge. He just watched. While we dug in deeper, improving our foxholes in the cold, sucking mud, he'd find a spot behind a thick tree stump, pull out a small, leather-bound notebook, and just start sketching, drawing, like he was on a Sunday picnic in the park. The men noticed. You'd hear them muttering, "What's the LT doing now? Writing a letter to his mommy?" I saw him as a coward from that first hour, hiding behind a log, scribbling in his little book while real soldiers worked. He was an officer, supposed to be leading, but all he did was hide. Our first contact with him in charge came 2 days later. It wasn't a major attack, just a German probe. The sudden, ripping sound of an MG-42 tearing the air apart is a sound that separates men from boys. The boys freeze, and Lieutenant Hayes froze. He was standing near the edge of our perimeter when the first burst came, and he just dropped flat into the mud, face down, completely still. He didn't give a single order. He didn't even shout for cover. He just disappeared. I had to take over. Johnson, on the bar, 3 o'clock. Miller, grenades. Keep your heads down. The training kicks in. You become a machine of violence and instinct. We fought them off. It was over in 10 minutes, leaving 2 of their guys sprawled in the mud and the rest melting back into the trees. When the shooting stopped, the silence was heavy. I crawled over to where Hayes was still lying. He hadn't moved an inch. For a second, I thought he was hit. I grabbed his shoulder and rolled him over. His eyes were wide with a terror so pure it made me sick. He was breathing in short, sharp gasps, a fish pulled from the water. He hadn't been hit. He'd been paralyzed by fear. My contempt hardened into something cold and sharp. This wasn't just a boy in over his head. This was a liability. A danger to every man here. I hauled him to his feet. "Get up, Lieutenant. The show's over." He just stared at me, his face ashen, unable to speak. He stumbled back to the center of our position and sat down heavily, his hands shaking. Later that evening, as the perpetual drizzle turned to a downpour, I watched him. He was away from the rest of the men, who were huddled together trying to get some warmth from a covered stove. He had his back against a tree, his poncho pulled over his head, and in the dim light, I could see it. He had that damn notebook out again. He was sketching. After freezing in a firefight that could have gotten us all killed, after showing the entire platoon that he was nothing but a scared child, he was hiding in the shadows and drawing in his book. I walked over, the mud squelching under my boots. I stood over him, a big shadow in the gloom. He looked up, his eyes still wide and haunted. I didn't have to say a word. He knew what I was thinking. He was the burden, the dead weight. And in a place like this, you cut the dead weight loose before it drowns you all. He closed his notebook and looked away, and I knew he'd heard me loud and clear. 3 days of miserable, soul-crushing rain later, a runner from Company HQ slid into my foxhole, smelling of wet wool and terror. He handed me a folded map, already damp and threatening to dissolve. Orders. The Germans had dug in on the other side of a shallow, muddy valley. A farmhouse and a barn, fortified with machine gun nests, and, according to intelligence, at least 1 anti-tank gun. Our company was to push them out by dawn. It was a simple plan on paper, the kind of plan drawn up by men in warm tents who didn't have to cross the open ground. It was a suicide mission. Lieutenant Hayes convened a meeting behind the dubious cover of a fallen log. He spread the map out, his hands trembling so slightly that only a man like me would notice. He pointed a clean finger at the farmhouse. "All right, men. The plan is a direct assault. First squad lays down covering fire here," he said, his voice thin and reedy against the drumming of the rain. "Second squad, my squad, will advance across this field and take the objective." He looked up, trying to project an authority he didn't possess. The men, my men, veterans of a dozen firefights, stared back at him with dead eyes. They knew what he was suggesting. A frontal charge across a muddy field into the teeth of an MG-42. It wasn't a plan, it was a death sentence. I let the silence hang for a moment before I stepped in. I had to. This kid was going to kill us all. "With all due respect, Lieutenant," I said, my voice low and even, "that field's a killing jar. They'll have it zeroed in for their mortars before we get 20 yards. I tapped a ridge on the map, a high spine of rock and trees that overlooked the entire valley, including the German position. "We need eyes up here. On Hill 112. Someone to watch our flank and spot their heavy weapons." I looked at my exhausted men, Miller, Johnson, the kid, Perez, and then I looked at Hayes. The plan formed in my mind, cold and ugly and necessary. I turned my full attention to him. "Lieutenant, your tactical knowledge would be best used in an overwatch position. You take the field phone and a spool of wire. Climb up to that ridge. From there, you can direct our movements, warn us of any counterattacks. It's the most important job of the operation. The linchpin." Every word was a lie. That ridge was the most exposed piece of ground in the whole sector. The Germans would have a sniper on it for sure. It was a one-way trip, but it would get him out of the way. It would save my men from his incompetence. To my surprise, a flicker of something, relief, crossed his face. He wouldn't have to run into the machine guns. He could hide and watch. He nodded, trying to look thoughtful and professional. "An excellent suggestion, Sergeant. A strategic command post. I'll do it." The other men exchanged glances. They knew what I was doing. They'd seen this kind of thing before. Nobody said a word. I helped Hayes myself, strapping the heavy wooden spool of communication wire to his back and handing him the E8 field telephone. His hands were clumsy with the straps. "It's a two-man job, usually, sir," I said, my voice flat. "But we're short on men." He shouldered his carbine and looked at me. For a moment, I saw the terrified boy behind the officer's uniform. He knew he was being sent away. Maybe he didn't know why, or maybe he knew all too well. I didn't care. I just needed him gone. I clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture that felt like a betrayal. "Don't get yourself killed up there, sir. And don't call us unless you see a whole panzer division coming. We'll be busy." He nodded wordlessly and turned, melting into the fog and the skeletal trees, a lone figure dragging a thin copper wire behind him. I watched him go, feeling nothing. As soon as he was out of sight, I gathered the rest of the squad. I kicked dirt over the map, where Hayes had pointed. "All right, forget that garbage," I growled. "Here's the real plan. We're not going anywhere near that open field. We're going to swing west, use that deep creek bed for cover, and come up on their flank behind the barn. We move in 10. The men nodded, their expressions grim but relieved. They had a plan they could believe in now. I didn't look back in the direction Hayes had gone. In my mind, he was already dead. It was the cost of doing business. One scared kid from Ohio in exchange for a dozen good men. In the grim arithmetic of the Herkin Forest, the math was simple. We moved like ghosts through the pre-dawn gloom, the creek bed providing perfect cover. The mud was deep, trying to suck the boots right off our feet, and the cold water seeped into everything, but we were hidden. Every few yards, I'd stop and listen, straining my ears for any sound other than the dripping trees and our own ragged breathing. Nothing. A grim satisfaction settled in my gut. This was how you did it. Not with a suicidal charge across an open field, but with cunning and patience. My plan was working. Hayes was probably already dead on his exposed ridge, a pointless sacrifice, but his foolishness had given us the freedom to do this the right way. We reached the point on the map where we were to climb out of the creek and hit the barn from its blind side. I sent Miller, my best scout, up the muddy bank first. He slithered over the top, lay still for a long minute, then gave me the all-clear sign. One by one, we followed, moving with the slow, deliberate grace of predators. The barn was 50 yards away, a dark hulk against the lightning sky. The farmhouse was another 100 yards beyond it. It was all quiet. Too quiet. A cold knot of unease tightened in my stomach. I'd learned in North Africa under Rommel's ghost that when a German position was this quiet, it was because they wanted you to get closer. I gave the signal. We moved forward in a scattered line, rifles up, stepping carefully over fallen branches. We were halfway to the barn when the world ended. It wasn't just one MG-42 that opened up from the farmhouse. It was three. Two from the house and one from the barn itself, a perfect interlocking field of fire. And then, worse, a fourth one started its hellish chatter from the woods behind us, right where we'd come from. They had let us walk right into the middle of it. The creek bed hadn't been a secret path. It had been a funnel. My brilliant plan. I had personally marched my men into the grinder. The air became a solid wall of lead. Men screamed and dropped. Johnson, my bar gunner, grunted as a burst stitched him across the chest, his heavy automatic rifle falling silent. Mortar rounds began to walk in, the sickly thump of them leaving their tubes followed by the terrifying shriek of their descent. They had the range perfectly. The explosions threw up geysers of mud and steel, each one a lottery of death. I screamed, "Cover! Get to cover!" But there was nowhere to go. We were caught in the open. The only cover was the very ground we were lying on. Perez managed to crawl behind a dead cow, its body already bloated, and started firing his Garand, the distinctive ping of his empty clips a pathetic counterpoint to the German machine guns. Miller was hit in the leg, screaming curses as he tried to drag himself toward a ditch. Our medic, a kid named Davison who we called Doc, was already overwhelmed, crawling from one wounded man to another under a sky full of shrapnel. I saw our radio operator take a direct hit from a mortar round. The radio, and the man carrying it, simply ceased to exist in a flash of red and black. We were cut off. No retreat. No support. No hope. I lay pressed into the mud, my face buried in the wet earth, the noise so loud it was a physical pressure. My ears rang, and the smell of cordite and blood filled my nostrils. This was it. This was how it ended. Not in a blaze of glory, but in a muddy field in a forgotten forest because I was too arrogant. Too sure I knew better than the scared kid I'd sent off to die. In the chaos and the terror, I didn't even think about Lieutenant Hayes. He was a ghost on a distant hill, a problem I had already solved. The real problem was the German infantry now advancing from the farmhouse, moving methodically to finish off the survivors of my perfect trap. I chambered a new round in my Thompson, my knuckles white. If I was going to die, I was going to take some of them with me. We were dead. I knew it with the cold certainty of a man who had seen death 100 times before. The German infantry was advancing, a line of gray figures moving confidently through the morning mist, their rifles held at the ready. The MG-42s were still hammering our position, pinning down the few of us who could still fight. I was whispering a prayer, or maybe a curse, when something changed. It wasn't a loud noise. In the middle of the symphony of battle, it was a single, quiet note. From the direction of Hill 112, the ridge where I had sent Hayes, came the clear, sharp crack of a single M1 carbine shot. I barely registered it. It was probably just a nervous German firing at shadows. But then, one of the advancing officers, a man waving his men forward with a pistol, suddenly stopped. His helmet flew from his head as if kicked by an invisible boot, and he crumpled to the ground. The Germans around him hesitated, looking around in confusion. Another crack echoed from the hill. One of the gunners on the MG-42 in the barn slumped over his weapon. The gun fell silent. The change was immediate. The pressure on us from that side was gone, a hole punched in the wall of lead that had boxed us in. The Germans were no longer focused on us. They were screaming, shouting orders in guttural bursts, pointing frantically up at the wooded ridge. They started firing wildly into the trees on Hill 112, wasting ammunition on a target they couldn't see. Then came a sound that made no sense, the unmistakable thump-thump-thump of a German potato masher grenade, but the explosion came from right inside their own lines, near the second machine gun nest in the farmhouse. More screams. The second MG-42 fell silent. It was chaos. They had a ghost in their machine, and it was tearing them apart from the inside. What in the hell is going on? Perez whispered from behind the dead cow, his eyes wide. I didn't have an answer. My mind was racing. Who was up there? It couldn't be Hayes. The kid was a coward, paralyzed by fear. He wouldn't have the nerve. Maybe another American unit was in the area? A lost patrol? It didn't matter. Whoever it was, they were giving us a chance. The German assault had stalled completely. Their perfect trap was being dismantled piece by piece by a single, invisible tormentor on the high ground. Suddenly, a massive secondary explosion rocked the entire valley. A geyser of fire and black smoke erupted from behind the farmhouse. The Ghost had found their ammunition. The blast sent a shock wave across the field, and the sound of 1,000 rounds cooking off began to pop and crackle like a grotesque celebration. The German advance turned into a rout. They were running, but not back the way they came. They were scattering, trying to get away from both us in the front and the Phantom on their flank. The remaining MG-42 fired a few more panicked bursts toward the hill before its crew abandoned it and fled. I didn't waste a second. Miller, Perez, on me. I yelled, my voice hoarse. Covering fire. Doc, get the wounded back to the creek bed. Now, move. The sight of the enemy running gave my men new life. Hope is a more powerful stimulant than morphine. Perez and Miller laid down a steady fire with their Garens, picking off the retreating Germans. I grabbed Johnson's bar. He wouldn't be needing it anymore, and began dragging our wounded men, one by one, back toward the relative safety of the muddy creek. The Ghost on the hill kept firing, a slow, methodical rhythm. A shot every 10 seconds. Each one precise. Each one creating more panic. I didn't know who he was. I didn't know if he was friend or foe. But he was buying us time. He was buying us our lives. And I was going to use every second he gave me. We fell back into the creek bed, a battered remnant of a platoon. We had 4 men dead and 3 wounded, Miller's leg being the worst. The German fire had stopped completely, replaced by an eerie silence broken only by the groans of the wounded and the distant crackle of the burning ammunition truck. The Ghost on the hill had gone silent, too. I counted heads, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. We had survived, but we were crippled, deep in enemy territory with no radio and little ammunition. The victory, if you could call it that, felt exactly like defeat. We were just waiting for the next wave, the one that would finally finish us. And then we heard it. A low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the mud and into our bones. The sound of a heavy engine. From behind the ruined farmhouse, a Panzer tank crawled into view, its long 75mm cannon swinging slowly, methodically, searching for targets. It was a Panther, sleek and deadly, and it was hunting us. My blood ran cold. We had nothing. No bazooka, no anti-tank grenades. We were just rats in a ditch, and the exterminator had arrived. The tank's turret stopped, its cannon pointing directly at our position. This was the end of the line. Just as the tank's machine gun coughed to life, sending a spray of dirt over our heads, a figure broke from the tree line near the German position. It was a lone American soldier, moving with a calm, deliberate purpose that seemed insane in the face of the steel monster. He ran in a low crouch, not away from the tank, but towards its flank, using the shell craters and the body of the dead cow as cover. It was Lieutenant Hayes. He was alive, and he was attacking a Panther with nothing but a carbine and a satchel bag I hadn't seen him grab. The tank crew was blind to him, their attention fixed on us. We watched, breathless, as Hayes closed the distance. He wasn't charging wildly. Every move was calculated. He was using the terrain, the exact dips and folds in the earth that he must have studied from his perch on the hill. He reached the tank's blind spot at its rear, swung himself up onto the engine deck, and placed a satchel charge directly over the air intake vents. He pulled the pin, rolled off the other side, and was sprinting for a ditch before the tank crew even knew he was there. The explosion was not large, but it was brutally effective. A muffled boom was followed by a geyser of thick, black smoke pouring from the back of the tank. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. The top hatch flew open and a German commander, black uniformed and furious, emerged, shouting. Before he could raise his pistol, the crack of Hayes's carbine echoed across the field. The commander folded and disappeared back inside the turret. A second crewman tried to scramble out of the side hatch and was met with the same fate. Then, silence. The behemoth was dead, a smoking monument to the lieutenant's impossible courage. He waited a long minute, then slowly got to his feet. He walked back across the muddy field, no longer a ghost, but a flesh-and-blood soldier, his clean uniform now caked in mud and streaked with grease. He stopped in front of me, his breathing heavy but his hands steady. The fear was gone from his eyes, replaced by a weary, focused calm. He looked at the wounded, at the dead, and then at me. "The hill is clear, Sergeant," he said, his voice level. "I've identified their primary and secondary defensive positions, and their mortar pits." He held out his leather-bound notebook. "It's all in here." I took it from him. My hands were shaking. I opened it, and it wasn't sketches. It was artistry of a different kind. Page after page of detailed, hand-drawn topographical maps of the valley. He had mapped every tree, every gully, every ruin. He'd drawn arcs of fire for the machine gun nests, calculated ranges, marked dead ground where a man could advance unseen. The drawing I'd seen him do wasn't an escape. It was his weapon. He hadn't been hiding from the war. He'd been studying it, dissecting it, finding its weaknesses with a pencil and paper while we were relying on brute force. He didn't hide because he was a coward. He hid because that was how you truly see the battlefield. I looked up from the brilliant, life-saving maps to the face of the young lieutenant. The boy was gone. A soldier stood in his place. A soldier who had saved us all. I had no words. There were no words for this. I just stood there, looking at him, and gave him a single, sharp nod. Later that night, after reinforcements had arrived, I found him sitting alone and passed him my flask. He took it without a word. And in the quiet understanding that passed between us, the debt was paid.